Did you know that we officially have two national anthems? You know what they are? God Defend New Zealand and God Save the King. I didn't know that until I was researching for today's message. We actually have two. One's God Save the King. Well, there you go. You learned something. I thought God Defend New Zealand was it. But there you go. It is the one I prefer, God Defend New Zealand. However, there we go. We've got that one as well. So God Defend New Zealand actually began as a poem. It was a poem written by Thomas Bracken. And in 1876, John Joseph Woods, a teacher at a Roman Catholic school in the mining town of Lawrence, put music to the poem, and it became our national song. The first Māori translation was made in 1878 by native land court judge Thomas Smith at the request of Governor Sir George Grey. And when compared to anthems around the world, this poem is remarkable both in its sentiment and writing, and that it has become our national song. Consider some of the words for our nation of indigenous people, a foreign empire, and migrant peoples of all nations. Verse 2 says, men of every creed and race gather here before thy face. Written in the 1800s, in the early life of a nation of different groups of people. Men of every creed and race gather here before thy face, asking thee to bless this place. God, defend our free land. From dissension, divisions, people falling out with each other, coming against each other. Guard us from that. Envy, hate, and corruption. Guard our state. Make our country good and great. God, defend New Zealand. Verse 4 has in it, let our love for thee increase. May thy blessings never cease. Isn't it great? We're asking for his blessing, but we're making a commitment in our prayer. Let our love for you, God, increase. It's a national song, national anthem, national prayer. Verse 5, make us faithful unto thee. God, defend our free land. Guide her in the nation's van, preaching love and truth to man. I'd say that this is a prophetic prayer. It's a call to the nation, isn't it? Our nation, being faithful to God, our nation preaching love and truth to man, working out, God, your glorious plan. God, defend New Zealand. What a wise and amazing prayer for our nation. A call to the peoples of this land to be faithful to God, to preach the gospel, love and truth, to be used in outworking God's glorious plan. Wow. And this prophetic expectation that men of every creed and race would gather here before God. And because of that, the prayer to guard all our different people groups from dissension, envy, and hate. How important is it for we, the church, and this whole nation of peoples to continue to pray that prayer more and more with greater fervency for this nation? I wanted to start the message today with our anthem to lead into reflection on the nation that we call Aotearoa, New Zealand, our New Zealand. And it's easy to live here without thinking where or what here is. We know where here is, but what is here, this nation? Is it just a land and home and politics about how decisions are made here? Or the kingdom of God on earth has a very particular view about land, has a very particular view about cities, community, and rulership. If you were to study those words throughout the scriptures, you might be surprised how much the Bible centers around issues related to those things. Land, cities, community, and rulership. We know that Genesis 1 clarifies who we are, why we were made, and our purpose here on earth, on this land. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. So the three domains of earth, that which is in the sea, that which is on the land, and that which is in the sky. Rule over it. Fill, replenish the earth. It was a call to move out across the earth. These instructions, of course, were before chapter 3, when we brought sin into the world. And with sin, the intent and call to fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over it was then confused with selfish motivation and corrupted by demonic manipulation. In short, mankind has replaced God's purpose for us to be like him and caring for the earth that he made and ruling over the creatures of the earth, to rejecting him, ravaging the earth, and ruling over each other. And so wars, politics, abuse, betrayal, corruption have all become a normal way for mankind to consume the earth rather than steward it. So what does the land of Aotearoa, New Zealand, mean to you? What is God's purpose for our nation? And when you read through and sing through that national anthem, I think we find some answers in it. What's the church's role in the care of this land and how it is ruled? We've just had Waitangi Day on Tuesday, and before it got to the political business of the day, it began with a powerful dawn service. And politics aside, a particular theme that was repeated through the Waitangi dawn service was the part and call to love. That is, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, needs to be kept in the context of love. The treaty that unites people living on this land can only work if our commitment is one based in love for one another. Quite a special consideration when we listen to the news and the debates and the protests regarding the treaty. The treaty, like a marriage covenant, if it's only a legal arrangement, can produce no good fruit. For those of us who've married, if all it is a legal arrangement, you can create another legal way to get out of it. If all you can say is, no, you need to do that because legally I've got the certificate that says that you must because we're married. There's no hope in that, is there? And if all the treaty is a legal arrangement, nothing good can come from that. But if it's an unconditional commitment to love one another, then the children of such a covenant are born from love, in love, and for love. Is that not the purpose of marriage? The marriage covenant? And so also the treaty needs love to be in the centre of it. And that's a far better foundation for producing unity in our land. Historian and theologian Dr. Alistair Rees explains, on the evening of February 5th, 1840, after a day of heated debate, the missionary Henry Williams explained the proposed treaty to the gathered Māori chiefs and included this statement about the treaty provided by Queen Victoria's officials. He says, "This is Queen Victoria's act of love to you. She wants to ensure you that you keep what is yours, your property, your rights and privileges, and those things you value." And that night, the chiefs agreed to sign and commit to the Treaty of Waitangi based on that explanation. The treaty is what protected Māori's rights from regarding their sovereignty, their land and culture. It also gave Māori rights as British citizens. And it ensured that the Crown and her English government would rule over and keep law and order for non-Māori in these lands. More and more people were coming to New Zealand, often with selfish interests, and many troublemakers came also. The treaty enabled foreigners to New Zealand a lawful way of belonging here and living and behaving. To have such a treaty provided an agreed foundation for protecting Māori and providing for non-Māori. And although not perfect, although not signed by all Māori chiefs, and although not necessarily understood nor wanted by some people moving to New Zealand at the time, to have such a unique and foundational treaty is a provision, I believe, of grace and wisdom. It means the Crown from a foreign land and the people of this land have a way of living together in unity, in peace, and hopefully in love. Without such a treaty, I believe war would likely have become necessary. Immorality and abuse would have become a normalised way of life for settlers, and eventually the saturation of foreign peoples here with their advanced weapons would have wiped out most Māori and enslaved the remainder. Because if you look through world history, that's just how it's done. That's just what happens over and over and over again. That's where New Zealand was heading, except the treaty intersected that. The treaty is more than a historical document or political debate or holiday observance. Te Tiriti o Waitangi is what makes us New Zealanders, a nation of peoples living alongside the indigenous people of the land. I dare not imagine a New Zealand without such a treaty. Sadly, as much as Queen Victoria and the officials providing the treaty were, I believe, sincere in their intent to protect and provide for Māori, there has been misunderstandings around some of the language and meaning of the treaty. And there has, of course, been gross betrayals of the treaty by both Crown and settlers. In the decades that followed the Crown and Māori chiefs signing the treaty, much land belonging to Māori was taken illegally and by political manipulation, and innocent people were imprisoned, mistreated, some even killed. Dignity was taken. Culture and language restricted, and racism and bigotry was rife. In July 1865, the influential chief and kingmaker, Wiremu Tamihana, petitioned Queen Victoria following the invasion in the Waikato. He wrote, "Madam, your covenant came to this land, and you said in good faith that the Māori should retain their chieftainship, their mana, and their lands. These are your declarations. And now, O Mother, assert your authority, the authority which has been trampled upon by Governor Grey, and give us back our land, our chieftainship, and our mana, of which the colonists and the governor are seeking to deprive us." It's a telling letter, isn't it? O Mother. Again and again over the last 184 years, Māori representatives, chiefs, and tribes have petitioned the Crown and the government on the basis of the treaty that both parties signed and committed to. These have not just been complaints about specific issues. These have been a call to come back to the treaty, the covenant the government and Māori have made that binds us all together on this land. It's an agreement on how we are all to live here, and without such agreement and commitment, only chaos, lawlessness and abuse will result. That's what global history tells us. It's like if you came to live in my house, but we didn't make any agreement on how we both would live there. There would be no basis for peace. There'd be no basis for unity. There'd be no basis for blessing. One of us will eventually subject the other. We need agreement and commitment to that agreement. So when the covenant and intent within the Treaty of Waitangi was ignored by the government in the decades following the signing of the treaty, plans, laws, foreign class systems, prejudice and greed subjected the indigenous people of this land to loss, to betrayal, and to oppression. So today's message is about the land to which we each believe God has called us to, and our responsibility here. How on earth shall we live here in New Zealand? How on earth, how on this land, how here should we live? And often we don't realise how we came to arrive in the ways we think and the way we see things. There's sociological terms like worldview, the way you view life and how you think it's supposed to work. But if we think of many people who come from a settling background, then settlers came here to start a new life, independent of the government, independent of the empire. They could have their own slice of land here and it'd be theirs for their own. And so a view of how to live here came in with that. And how many of us have a view of, I'm here to get what I want, my dream, my piece of pie. And so we need to rethink, how do we live here together in unity? What is it that God's got us here for? We're blessed to have a treaty to start us on this journey, and the scriptures of God to guide us in how to build upon the foundation of that treaty. The next part of this message will be provided by Jacinta Gomez, who will help us understand the context of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and also share her perspective as a Māori descendant. Please welcome Jacinta.
Morena. Oh, it's loud. E tō mātou matua ki te rangi, ke tapu tō ingoa, ke tai mai tō rangatiratanga, ke mea te tau e pai a ki runga i te whenua kiri tino ki tō te rangi. O mai kia mātou aina he taro mā mātou mo tēnei rā. Muru o mātou hara, mu mātou hoki e muru nei i o te hanga e hara ana kia mātou. Aua hoki mātou e kawea kia whakawaenga, engari whakaorangi a mātou e te kino. Nā hoki te rangatiratanga, te kaha me te kororea, ake, āmene. Ko mā tātua te waka, ko waiawa te awa, ko māke o te maunga, ko ngā te patu te hapu, ko te whakatohia te iwi, ko inuera kirirangi tōku kuia, ko Arthur rawa ko Christine o ku mātua. So I just want to start by saying the Lord's Prayer, acknowledging who is the Lord above over all of us, but also just sharing with you my whakapapa, where I come from, my place in Te Ao Māori. So in Te Ao Māori, it's important to acknowledge the context in which you stand, and pepeha, which I just shared before, tells people where and from whom you come. And often mihi acknowledges those who come before, those who host, and other myriad of things, kaupapa, the topic of the discussion. So the relevance of this being we aren't self-made and we're not self-contained entities. And it's important for us as humans to humble ourselves in context. And in the case of this particular topic, often it's a lack of understanding which causes fear in people when it comes to conversation around te tiriti and te ao Māori in general. And as people of faith, what should we do with our fear? Faith doesn't eliminate questions, but faith knows where to take them, which is a quote from Elizabeth Elliot. So there are a lot of things that we won't understand about this topic this side of heaven, but in faith we can connect it to the context of God and ask Him to help us see it through His eyes. So at this point I just want to make a disclaimer that what I've got to share with you guys this morning is a very, very abridged account of history, and I would encourage all of you to search out information for yourself if you're engaging in discussion around Te Tiriti. Please don't just quote what I say here today as a be-all and end-all. Its intended purpose is only for like a snippet of enlightenment to spark you guys to seek more understanding for yourself. Cool. So we know where we're heading with what I have to share. I've got 3 basic points. So context of the people, of the interactions, and why the treaty was needed in the first place. 2, the content, what it actually says. So unless I think even when I was in high school, unless you picked history as a subject, often the treaty wasn't actually talked about. So I'm not sure how in-depth it's got to in high schools these days, but often you don't actually know what it says. You're kind of just going on what media and stuff is talking about. So I'll break it down a little bit. And then thirdly, my connection and my personal take on how this all fits. So we're going to start with the context where we're a good place to start, basically. So I'd like to explain the traditional social structure of Māori society with words that you potentially may know, you may have heard, but you might not know where they fit. So to begin with, the word Māori itself, it actually began to be used at the time of interaction when Western explorers were arriving here, and they couldn't differentiate. They'd sail down the coast from one group to another, and they couldn't differentiate between the people groups they were coming in contact with. And they're like, you need a collective name so we know what to call you guys. And so the word Māori was used. The native people were like, well, we're normal. Māori means normal. We're normal and you guys aren't. So Pākehā actually just means the opposite of that. It means not normal in the sense of foreign, not like not normal, but like we're Māori, we're normal, we understand. You're Pākehā, you're foreign, we don't, you're new to us. And the terms have kind of just evolved today to mean someone who is descended from Māori or someone who is not. So that's a good start. Then you have the terms iwi, hapu, and whānau, which you guys may have heard. So iwi is often translated as the word tribe. It was the largest political unit of which members recognised themselves sharing a common descent. So, that's very little. I don't know how comprehensive this picture is because I'm not fully versed in all iwi that exists in New Zealand, but that's a general gist of the breakdown of iwi in New Zealand. And if you look, there we go. That's Te Whakatohea area, which is where my ancestors are from. So you have iwi. So the iwi was then made up of multiple hapu, often translated as sub-tribe. And this is actually where, in essence, political power and decisions were made from in the hapu. And then hapu were made up of family units or whānau. So it's important for us with Western understanding to know that although we have collectivised all iwi into all Māori, iwi actually have distinct differences, even now in stories and traditions and in dialects, so different words are pronounced differently depending on where you are. So if we add into this the fact that a lot of early interaction with Westerners and missionaries was focused mostly in the North Island, particularly the Bay of Islands, which is where Waitangi is, that's actually Ngāpuhi country. So a lot of the early settlers were engaging mostly with Ngāpuhi and not necessarily much with those who lived here in the South Island. And then Nigel mentioned before that after the treaty was signed, it was sent around, and it was taken around the land for other hapu to sign in the rest of New Zealand. Some areas were missed, so some hapu missed out on signing, and some just out and out refused to sign it. So you will hear that in the news sometimes, we never signed the treaty, which is actually, there were a few that just refused to. So if we add all these main points together and know that different iwi, it comes to the sum of different iwi have different kōrero, different conversations around interaction with missionaries and settlers, around the government, around injustice, around treaty settlements, and so many other things. One iwi experience or story is not all iwi experience or story, just for us to remember. If you're a historian or you're a person who likes to research and you're interested in exploring what that means in our context here in Christchurch and Canterbury, the whenua, the land on which we reside, is Kaitahu, Kate Momoe and Waitaha country. So you'll hear Ngaitahu. K is, the NG is pronounced K when you're talking from Kaitahu dialect. So you're welcome to explore that. So from there, that's general social structure. From there, Abel Tasman, you guys may know of Abel Tasman, he arrived in 1642. He never actually landed, he just kind of sailed around, had a wee look, and got scared and went away. Then James Cook in 1769, and then the actual signing of the treaty in 1840. Interactions between the people groups were varied, so there were some foreigners that actually lived amongst iwi quite peaceably, quite fine. Sometimes there was cultural misunderstandings, and that resulted often in loss of life on both sides. There were whaler and trading ships coming through the country, so they traded with local iwi for supplies for their ships. Obviously, a long time at sea, you need to stock up. And then, Māori people were quite inquisitive, so a lot of them there was a lot that jumped on ship and just kind of went off to explore and see what was out there. And often these Māori joining these ships were mistreated. Sometimes they were just kidnapped. They'd come to meet the people on the ships, and then the ship would just leave with them on board. And then sometimes I read a few cases where they stopped in another land, and then they just left them in another land, just sailed off and left them there. So there was a bit of exploration, and there was settlers coming and all that sort of thing. But as more and more settlers and traders and whalers were arriving, as Nigel mentioned, lawlessness became a problem, because if crime is committed, British law held no jurisdiction here. So if something was happening and it was unjust, you couldn't just call the police and be like, this is happening, because they don't have any jurisdiction in this land. So in a move to deal with this increased lawlessness and disorder, in 1831, 13 Ngāpuhi chiefs, with the help of a missionary, sent a letter to the king. It was the king at the time, and then Queen Victoria came along. So they sent a letter to the king in England and asked for his help and help was sent in the form of a guy called James Busby, but he didn't really have any power. He was just kind of go fix, but they didn't give him any money or people to help him out. Hang on. Yeah, so he was here, he couldn't do much, so the lawlessness kind of just continued to be an issue, and there was also concerns at that stage that other international entities were showing an interest in New Zealand. So Busby decided in his limited power that he would take a step further. So he gathered some northern chiefs together, and 34 of them signed what is known as He Whakaputanga o Te Rangatira o Nutereni, or the Declaration of Independence. So if you're a visual person, that He Whakaputanga is what you'll see around in the news, and it just basically, it's the Declaration of Independence. And so 34 chiefs signed, and then more added their signatures later. And they were seeking to create an official status for New Zealand, in addition to this flag, the United Tribes of New Zealand flag, which was created a few years earlier. So the declaration itself asserted power and authority in the land resided with a confederation of United Tribes. So they also asserted that no foreigners could make laws, and in return for protection of the British subjects that were currently living in this land, they asked for protection from the king for any foreign threats that may be looming. So according to a lot of documentation, a lot of articles and stuff that I've read, the Māori perspective of this Declaration of Independence was that it was a way, it was their way of safeguarding their people, their independence, and their ways of life in the face of rapid change. There's just so much stuff happening. They wanted to protect what they had, so they made the declaration, and that was their perspective on it. But the British perspective didn't hold it in such high regard as what the chiefs did. So there was already kind of a differing understanding of what was the state of New Zealand. Yeah, so the declaration was made, it was sent off to England, but despite these steps that were made to deal with the lawlessness and external threats, they continued to expand rapidly, obviously, humans coming together, making messes. And adding to this was the ruthless economic ambitions of a guy called, I'm sure there was more, but the guy that stands out in history is this guy called Edward Gibbon Wakefield, he was actually a criminal, but that's kind of brushed over. And he planned to some and he succeeded in some extent of creating a private colony. He was attempting private colonisation to make his own wee kingdom, I guess. And he just used really dirty methods of getting land. He's not a great guy. And he's trying his hardest to get all this stuff happening before someone like the Crown stepped in to kind of stop what he was doing. So pressure from all these sides kind of brought to bear on the Colonial Office, and it convinced the leaders there that British annexation was actually necessary. So that's the state of what we were at in the 1830s. But another important thing I just want to add here is the context that the missionaries had in this place. The missionary involvement in this land, it actually stemmed from a collection of people in England called the Clapham sect, which you may or may not have heard of. They were responsible for pushing the abolition of the slave trade in England. So if you know of a guy called William Wilberforce, he was one of the big names amongst the Clapham sect. They also at this stage recognised the need for a change in the way Indigenous peoples in the colonies were being treated. Obviously, we know in Australia and in North America things aren't great. So they recognised what was happening there, and they're like, we need to change the way we treat Indigenous peoples. It's not great. So they formed the Church Missionary Society with the intention of bringing the gospel to Indigenous peoples, but also defending them against mistreatment and being taken advantage of. And from this group came a number of people who influenced what was happening in New Zealand. And some of the more significant names on that list are Henry Williams, who arrived in 1823, and his brother William Williams, who arrived in 1826. And both of these men were held in really high regard in the iwi that they lived amongst, because they went out of their way, they made every effort to understand the language, to understand the customs, to get to know the people, and not just pigeonhole them as to who they were. They were also amongst those who established, so you may or may not be aware, Te Reo Māori is actually an oral language, and the established written language was begun by Henry Williams and his people. And they also began translating the Bible into Te Reo Māori, which is pretty cool. And Henry and his son Edward were the ones who were called on by William Hobson to translate the treaty into Te Reo, and Nigel had a wee quote before about that. Hobson was also kind of playing on the trust, like people recognised the fact that the iwi actually trusted these guys in particular because they were investing into them. So he was kind of playing on the fact that if Henry and William and all that are on board, then the chiefs would be more easily convinced as to the rightness of signing the treaty. So as I will address shortly, there is actually differences in the translations between the English version and Te Reo Māori translation. So it may seem that Henry Williams, who was the translator, misled and deceived the chiefs who trusted him, but there's a guy called Keith Newman who wrote a book I'll tell you about later, but he wrote in his book that after Henry Williams had seen what this guy Wakefield was up to, just ruthlessly acquiring land, and you could kind of see what was happening. If there's all this ruthless land acquiring was happening, then you can see where the future is going. And he came back to the Bay of Islands at this stage, and so Keith Newman writes that Williams felt that he had no other option than to assist in the process of drawing up the Treaty of Waitangi in order to ensure that it was as favourable as possible to Māori. Henry and Edward were given a little over a day to convey the intent of the document to the chiefs in Māori. The translation was pivotal. If too much authority was removed from the chiefs, they wouldn't sign. So if we're to take into consideration at this time that there were roughly 2,000 permanent English settlers living here and an estimation of around 90,000 Māori, significantly different numbers, and then the chiefs had not 5 years earlier declared their authority in the land, the fact that the chiefs had signed Te Tiriti indicates that they surely weren't going and expecting to give up what authority and mana or rights and identity that they held. So what do they believe they were actually agreeing to? Well, which leads us to contents. Hang on. I have here... Water went down the wrong hole. So there are three, technically, there was a fourth article that was added to the treaty on the day, which basically is the Pompelier, I think he's the Catholic guy, was like, you have to add in there rights to religious freedom. So like, okay then, so they wrote it in. So often it's not addressed because it was kind of just added in on the day. And there's also a preamble, which is quite significant. But the main things are significant is different chunky, but it's just laying out what's going to come ahead. So I'm going to read for you guys Article 1, 2 and 3, which is the things that are discussed the most that you'll hear about, and then I'll summarise them because it's in ye olde English. Here we go. Article 1. There we go. So this is the English translation, the English version, which was then translated into Te Reo. So English translation says, the chiefs of the Confederation of the United Tribes of New Zealand and the separate and independent chiefs who have not yet become members of the Confederation cede to Her Majesty the Queen of England absolute and without reservation all the rights and powers and of sovereignty which the said confederation or individual chiefs respectively exercise or possess, or may be supposed to exercise or to possess over their respective territories as the sole sovereigns thereof. Summary. Māori cede to the sovereignty of New Zealand to Britain. Standard. Article number 2, a bit chunkier. Her Majesty the Queen of England confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand and to the respective families and individuals thereof the full exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, forests, fisheries and other properties which they may collectively or individually possess so long as it is their wish and desire to retain the same in their possession. But the chiefs of the United Tribes and the individual chiefs yield to Her Majesty the exclusive right of preemption over such lands, as the proprietors thereof may be disposed to alienate at such prices as may be agreed upon between the respective proprietors and persons appointed by Her Majesty to treat with them in that behalf. It's a lot of language. Summary. Māori are guaranteed full rights of ownership of their lands, forests, fisheries and other possessions, and the Crown has the exclusive first right to purchase lands iwi choose to sell. So if iwi decided they wanted to sell their land, they have to first offer it to the government to sell. So the idea was that it kind of cuts out messy sales. They'd sell to the Crown and then the Crown went on sale, and you kind of be aware of what was happening. And then finally, Article 3. In consideration thereof, Her Majesty the Queen of England extends to the natives of New Zealand her royal protection and imparts to them all the rights and privileges of British subjects. Summary, Māori are given the rights and privileges of British subjects. That one's a bit easier. So the translation differences. In Article 1, the word used in the Māori translation for sovereignty was the word kawanatanga, a word which actually means governance, not sovereignty, which can kind of, what does that mean? This word was actually a new word. I think it's a transliteration, as in they took a word that kind of sounds like government into Te Reo Māori and made kawanatanga. And it was made when they were translating the Bible, so the understanding that the chiefs had of the word kawanatanga was from the context of the Bible. So the concept, so if you think about it, when you're looking in the New Testament, which was mostly what they were using, the governor, when they're talking about a governor, it's usually in relation to the more superior Caesar, the ruler. So the governors aren't actually the be-all, end-all power. So they're like, oh yeah, governance, yep. And also in their context, they don't have, in Te Ao Māori at that stage, the concept of a central one-person ruler over all people in the land was not something that existed. As I mentioned at the start, the power of the political power and all that sort of stuff lay within the hapu, the smaller of the iwi. So this idea of this one queen who rules her entire country was just a bit foreign to them. And as at the declaration, the chiefs had stated that no foreigners could make laws. So the understanding was that the queen was, hang on. Yeah, so their understanding of this is that the Queen was allowed to control her subjects, the English people that lived here, but their rangatiratanga, their sovereignty, their authority, their mana remained with them. So that's kind of a significant difference. There we go. And then this Article 2, where in the English translation it guaranteed Māori undisturbed possession of their land and properties. The Māori version guaranteed tino rangatiratanga, and this word actually means full authority or self-determination, sounds like sovereignty, over whenua, land, over taonga, a prize thing, which could be a physical possession, but it could also be things like custom or knowledge. So those are pretty significant differences if you really think about it. And there are many other factors that are added to this, but the most important ones in the context that we're discussing, over 500 chiefs signed Te Tiriti, the Te Reo Māori copy. There was an English copy, but only 39 people actually signed that. So they were signing, what they were agreeing to was actually the Te Reo version, not the English version. And there's actually international law when documents conflict, when there's a translation and things don't match up. If there's ambiguity, the I googled this and I still can't say it. Contra preferentum principle applies, which means that a decision is made against the party who drafted the document, and an Indigenous language text takes preference. So as far as the chiefs who chose to sign Te Tiriti were concerned, they maintained authority over their people, over their land, over their taonga, their prized possessions, and the Queen would take care of her subjects. However, since the signing of the treaty, things have changed, obviously, and as Nigel has stated, pretty much all of those articles were broken. So, you can understand, how messy things are. So that is the context. And the last thing I have to share, is connection. Preparing myself for emotions. So what I find personally difficult when it comes to this kaupapa, this topic, is the belief that the only way is to slot Māori into English society, civilising their savage ways. A belief that Māori were less than and that they're being made better. That the best thing would be to assimilate them and make them brown Westerners. The arguments and justifying of what's happening in New Zealand and that the treaty is just too messy and it's not worth it, let's just move on. It's history, let's just keep going. And I see this represented in the accounts. I'm a historian at heart, I love history. And I see this represented in the accounts that I read of history and how quickly and thoroughly the treaty was disregarded after it was created and signed. I see it even in the core of some politics today. I can see it in my younger self when I was primary schooler, and I have distinct memories of trying to wash the brown off me so I'd fit in. And wondering how I could be a Māori person and a Christian. I couldn't marry the two in my head. It was a subconscious thing until I was about 20. And someone said to me, so how does it work being Christian and Māori? And I was like, oh, actually I've been thinking that my whole life. I can sense it in the shame when I hear my dad talk of things from his history. And when I hear stories of my nana and the things that she went through and the shame she must have felt. Actually, she lived in the north. She lived in Tikawiti, which is near Hamilton. And I can count on one hand the amount of times I got to spend time with my nana. And the funny thing is the shame that I hear talked of with, when it comes to stories that my nana that I hear from other people. She actually, when she found Christ, she taught herself to read and write in English, because Māori was her first language, but she taught herself to read and write in English using the Māori Bible. I'm like, man, that's pretty badass, it's pretty cool. So she was like, pretty awesome. But, you know, the shame does weird things to people and you kind of don't recognise your own strengths when it's heavy. But then also, the relief I experienced less than 10 years ago, when the Lord sang to me from this verse. Oh, it's tiny. It's in your newsletter, you can read it there. Revelation 7:9. I can't even read that. Someone got a newsletter? Why do you guys not have newsletters? You got good eyesight. Hang on, I'll give it a shot. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. From every nation, from all tribes, from all peoples and all languages. And that really stood out to me less than 10 years ago, and I was like, oh, okay. So in eternity, I imagine faces with moko kawai, faces with mata ora, worshipping before the throne of the Lord alongside all other nations and all tribes and all tongues. Ko te whakaoranga ki tō tātou atua, e noho nei runga i te torona, ki te reme hoki. Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Ko te whakapai, ko te kroria, ko te mātauranga, ko te whakawhitai, ko te honore, ko te mana, ko te kaha, kei tō tātou atua. Ake, ake, amene. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks, honour and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen. That God doesn't seek homogeneity or sameness in his people, that he seeks hearts surrendered. Te tiriti is important to me because it is the way by which my Pākehā ancestors have the right to be here. The Portuguese, the Scottish, the Australian, the English ancestors that I have, they have the right to be here because of it. Because by it, my Māori ancestors agreed to enter into partnership in the sight of God with those who wanted to call New Zealand home, in the understanding that the things they held precious and sacred would be protected. Because it is a covenant to be kept. Our God is a God who keeps covenant. Why would we seek to be anything other than the example he lays before us? If this is something that potentially you've pondered or you want to look into, I recommend these two books. This one here, Bible and Treaty. It's quite chunky, so if you're you enjoy reading, it's a good one. If reading's kind of scary, this one, there we go. Hui Come Home is actually, the guy who wrote it was basing a lot of his words on Bible and Treaty. He read those and kind of made it a slightly smaller book and in context of the church. So you're welcome to look into those books. But that's my recommendation for you guys. Back to Nigel.
Kia ora. Well done, Cinta. It's a massive topic to boil down. And if you like a good chunky technical read, I agree that Bible and Treaty is an awesome one. If you're like me and you like something smaller, it's the Hui Comes Home is actually a real easy read. It's really well written. I was so impressed with it. So I encourage you to do a bit of schooling up there. I think because of the political handling of issues around race and governance, ownership and the treaty, we can see the Treaty of Waitangi as a problem for New Zealand. But I think it's the complete opposite. I think it's God's gracious provision, not problem. It's a provision for New Zealand. Hopefully today's message has helped you feel more confident and positive about Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It's the foundation for unity, for justice and peace in our land. I think we're blessed to have this treaty. Our problem in New Zealand is that we're so far removed from the original concepts of commitment, faithfulness, and especially covenant. When Jacinta read through the articles of the treaty in English, how many had no idea what all that language really meant? And it's your language if you're Pākehā, correct? You need to be a lawyer well versed in historical law to what a lot of that meant. And here they're trying to say, hey, Māori, sign that. It's real good for you. What? And the numbers were significant. What were the numbers at that time, Jacinta, of Māori population? And not around 90,000 Māori. How many non-Māori? 2,000. And the 2,000 saying, hey, sign this weird language. It's a different language. It's legal speak. And then it had to be translated. And then to think that we'd understand the same way. So if you're only familiar with one language, whenever you translate a different language, it's never exactly the same. You can try and make it the same, but you can't make it the same. And often it's because of the meaning of words different, and especially that some words we have in English, other languages around the world don't have a word for that. So it becomes really complicated. Hence why there's been a lot of tension around those translation things. But then also you've got this rhetoric coming through about, hang on, we're one people, we're one nation made of lots of peoples. We need to be united. We can't elevate one race over another. You started to hear that come through? There's now policy sort of being formed to try and figure out how that we can make us all equal. And it's a complete misunderstanding of actually something that comes from the Bible. Something that comes from the kingdom of God too. And it's this whole thing of what it means for the indigenous people called to a land and then those who come after. I won't get too much into that, but I think we have to understand that if we're to try and grasp the challenges around multiple people living here with the indigenous people and what the treaty actually means and the purpose of it, we need to come back to what does commitment mean, what does faithfulness mean, what does covenant mean, and what's our responsibility of those three things. And that's where the church of Jesus Christ comes in. We have sacred scriptures that teach us what faithfulness to covenant is all about. In fact, the whole concept of the treaty between the Crown and Maori was based upon the biblical concept of covenant. That's hard to say, sorry. That's where the basis of the treaty came from. The treaty was framed and promoted and explained to Māori chiefs, many of whom were Christians at that stage, as the same type of compact or agreement used throughout the Bible. The treaty is a covenant. Our Bible is separated into Old Testament and New Testament. What does that mean? Old covenant and New covenant. That's your Bible. Many Māori would have read in the Bible about the covenant that God had made with the people of Israel. God said to Israel in the wilderness, in making them a nation, making them his nation, he said this, now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, it's my covenant I'm making with you. If you keep that covenant, then out of all nations you'll be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you were to speak to the Israelites. Exodus 19, Exodus 24. This is Moses. He took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. So the book of the covenant, a written covenant between God and this group of people. He read it to them. And they responded, we will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey. What are they doing? They're making a pledge, a vow, a commitment to that covenant that they will obey it. They will keep the terms of the covenant. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. The blood sealed it, and it could not be changed. It could not be repealed. It could not be altered. God made a covenant with Noah, a covenant with Abraham, a covenant with Israel through Moses, a covenant with David. Biblical marriage is built on a covenant. It's a covenant relationship. And most importantly, our eternal salvation and life is based wholly upon a covenant God has made with us through Jesus. That's a covenant that can't be broken because Jesus signed the covenant for us. His blood poured out at his death on the cross was his signature that sealed the deal. We can't do anything about it. It was done 2,000 years ago. We could not arrange it. We could not provide it. We could never afford it. God could forgive us, cleanse us of all our unrighteousness, and make you and I his holy son or daughter because of that covenant. And only because of that covenant made for us through Jesus' death and life. Jesus' death for our life. And this biblical context was the basis of the language used with Māori regarding the treaty. How significant is that? One of the amazing things is that the gospel going out into Aotearoa had the effect of one of the fastest evangelism growth rates. That is, many Māori very quickly became followers of Jesus Christ. Huge percentage of Māori became Christians because of this gospel, this covenant made by Jesus that brought peace. The biblical context for the language around that is critical. And so I think the church has a legacy of responsibility in this land. The first message we preached on this land was in 1814 by Samuel Marston, and he preached from the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 2, verse 10. He said, in the words of Jesus, in the words of the angel given to people at that time, I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. That's the first message of the gospel preached on this land. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all people. And the church built relationship with Māori. They learnt their language, translated the scriptures for them, helped them into a covenant relationship with the Crown. And the Crown and many colonists and settlers betrayed that covenant, and our young nation has been raised in a dysfunctional, abusive and divided context ever since. So there's a responsibility, I believe, for the church to step back in and say, not so much for Māori, but turn it around the other way and come back to the Crown, come back to the government, come back to non-Māori and say, hang on, let us translate to you what covenant means. Let us translate to you what faithfulness means. Let us translate to you what commitment and love means. And that's my challenge for you today. If we really want to see actual peace in our land, if we want to see functional relationship between people groups, and remember that our population at the moment is growing rapidly, but with a very accelerated rate of growth from migrant people coming in. It's not a bad thing. It's just I'm saying that there are many, many, many more people coming in from other places. What does it mean to live here together on this land in unity, in agreement, in peace? And where does love come into that? Who will explain faithfulness, covenant? Who will bring us to that place of being one people under God? And what does it mean for all the people groups to live in unity with the indigenous people of this land? We, the church, can use our life in covenant with God and each other as a light for our nation. And maybe we can break that curse and help bring all peoples here into the great joy the gospel provides. Our nation needs our prayers, it needs our message, and it needs our example of faithfulness to covenant. And like the Church of early New Zealand, you and I have a significant part to play, because politics can't solve a broken covenant, because it's a relational one, not just a legal one. If you'd like some further understanding on the church's role in the treaty and the biblical context for the treaty, send me a message, because the books that Jacinta put up there are excellent resources, but there's also from Dr. Alice Rees, a theologian and historian, a really excellent article that he's written about the language and the influence of the Bible. In fact, the context of the Bible that actually established parts of that treaty and was explained to Māori. And it's fascinating to find how that was done. So if you'd like that, do send me a message. I'd love to send that to you and for us to gain a better understanding, especially because you're going to hear a lot more talk about these things coming up, but they'll be disconnected from the context of the origins of the scriptures, of what covenant means, and also the kingdom view that you and I have access to through the Bible. For the last part of our service, we're going to have communion together and reflect again on the goodness of God, but through the lens of the covenant made by Jesus. We sang about it before. But the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. And he said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Whenever we do this, we're proclaiming Jesus' death, not to mourn the death, not to feel bad about where we've failed, but to recognize he's done what we could not do. He's paid with his body and his blood for our lives, secured salvation, secured righteousness, secured eternity. All the promises of the covenant are accessed through the blood. All the blessings. Jesus said he came to bring life in all its fullness. It's through his blood. It's through his death paying for that. His death making that way. And that covenant cannot be changed. It's a covenant that God has made with us through Jesus. And we can only receive it by faith and trusting what he's done. We can't earn it. Our race doesn't deserve it. There's nothing on earth that can provide for it. We're simply trusting what Jesus did. You can see why it's so important for us to come back to the roots of covenant and the concept of treaty. We live our life out of a covenant made by God through Jesus' blood. And it's only because of that we have eternal life. Amen? So why don't you just take a moment now and just think about for yourself just all the goodness of God that the team shared about last Sunday. All the promises in the Word, all the blessings that come because of what Jesus has done on the cross to bring you into that. And it can't be taken away. He's done it for you.